This is the World Organic News for the week ending 12th of December 2016. Jon Moore reporting. This week we begin with news from the Academy. Those curiously named solar cells, perovskites, have hit new efficiency levels. The blog, Great Things from Small Things, Nanotechnology Innovation, brings us the post, Perovskite solar cells hit new world efficiency record. Quote, "They're flexible, cheap to produce and simple to make, which is why perovskites are the hottest new material in solar cell design. And now engineers at Australia's University of New South Wales and Sydney have smashed the trendy new compound's world efficiency record." End quote. This is wonderful news. Non-fossil fuel-based energy is the way forward. After generations of research focused on fossil fuels, bright minds are now, and have for a little while, been driving alternatives. Perovskites are quick and cheap to manufacture, increasingly efficient, but do suffer some stability issues in open weather. There are workarounds to overcome these issues, and the increasing efficiencies may make these drawbacks irrelevant. The research continues, and with it, hope for the future. Yet, even using standard PV cells, it is possible to make great advances. The blog Antinuclear brings us a post entitled, "Australia can get to zero emissions as rooftop solar booms." Funnily enough, if price signals are sufficiently strong and the technology serviceable, individuals will make decisions which collectively benefit all of us. This is what's happened in Australia with rooftop solar cells. To such an extent that the CSIRO, that's the Commonwealth Scientific Industrial Research Organisation, can see them as Australia's pathway to zero emissions. Quote, "Consumers using rooftop solar panels and batteries will produce about a third and a half of Australia's electricity by mid-century, if the right policies are introduced, according to a roadmap from the CSIRO and power and gas transmission body Energy Network Australia." There's a link to that site in the show notes. Back to the quote. The 2-year analysis also found an emissions intensity scheme for the electricity sector, a form of carbon trading, that was what was to be considered by a government climate policy review, until that plan was abandoned last week, would be the cheapest way to cut carbon dioxide emissions, end quote. The report suggests the entire electrical grid could be zero carbon emitting when rooftop solar is coupled with batteries by 2050. Whilst this doesn't deal with road transport and other emitters of CO2, the grid is a great place to start. Now we move on to another great news story. Suzanne's mum's blog brings us the post, "Detroit Sustainable Agrihood." Given the economic disasters which have befallen Detroit in the last 30 years, this post is one of great promise. As vast swathes of Detroit were abandoned following the crisis of 2008, land has become available for alternative use, to be specific, for food production. From the blog, quote, "This week, the Michigan Urban Farming Initiative reveals its plans for the first sustainable urban agrihood in the North End." Wait, an agrihood? It's an alternative neighbourhood growth model positioning agriculture as the centrepiece of a mixed-use development. There are some agrihoods around the country, but in rural areas. This is the first within a city limit, end quote. From the great pains of economic downturn comes the possibility of a better way to live. Food grown where it is consumed, local employment, renewal in a future. I recommend a reading of the whole post. It is very uplifting. The link, of course, is in the show notes. "How Soil is Lost" is a post from the blog Make Wealth History. I think we've made the point in earlier episodes that without soil we are in dire straits. This post reminds us of how precious this resource is and how we are losing it. Quote, "Soil is a self-maintaining system. In nature, it looks after itself. When humans intervene with agriculture, the balance can be lost and the process is interrupted. Soil works in tandem with the vegetation that grows from it, as a mutually reinforcing dynamic. Plants need soils, and soils need plants. Unfortunately, we tend to clear the land completely in order to choose what grows from it, breaking that cycle. Then we haul away what's been grown, keeping the grain as food and baling up the stalks, rather than letting the soil reabsorb the nutrients. The result is a gradual loss of fertility. We have to make up the difference from chemical fertilisers, end quote. And we've discussed that in the past as well. Given the long history of agriculture and its increased pace with population growth, we could be in for trouble. So far, extreme soil losses have been relatively confined to nation states. Think of the US Dust Bowl of the Great Depression and the dust storms from northern China covering Beijing with topsoil in the late 1990s. The Post, though, provides some sobering statistics. Quote, globally, the equivalent of 10 million hectares of arable land is lost every year. In the last 150 years, we have lost half the world's topsoil. When land is exhausted, farmers move on and start somewhere else. The FAO estimates that 20 million hectares of farmland is abandoned every year. End quote. The good news is we can reverse this. Permaculture, natural farming, agroforestry and biodynamic methods, to name but a few options we already know work and are productive and sustainable. Remember, the US Dust Bowl was reversed through good soil retention techniques. We can reverse, indeed we must reverse the trend whilst we can. And that brings us to the end of this week's podcast. If you've liked what you've heard, please tell everyone you know any way you can. I'd also really appreciate a review on iTunes or the podcatcher of your choice. This helps others to find us. Thanking you in advance. On the matter of reviews, I would like to thank James112 for his review on Stitcher. Unfortunately, it was 3 months ago and I only found it last week, but I really do appreciate the effort. Thank you, James. Any suggestions, feedback or criticisms of the podcast or blog are most welcome. Email me at podcast@worldorganicnews.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back in a week.